Caitlin. I am from MD of Provost, and I'll be the moderator for tonight. I would like to thank you guys for attending on behalf of Cows and Fish, as well as numerous other municipalities who all came together to plan and host this webinar series. So this evening's webinar is the last webinar of our series. So there was 3 before. COVID prevented our group from hosting our annual in-person event, unfortunately. So we decided to take a virtual approach for now, and I hope you all enjoy. Just a few housekeeping items for this evening. If you have any questions, you can type them into the Q&A box at the bottom. Just since it's a small group, any questions you have, we'll shoot over to Kelly and she can answer them as we go. Following the presentation, there will be a draw for a $50 PV Mart gift card. So you guys have pretty good odds. It's just a little bonus for attending. So we'll just ask the winner to put their address into the chat so we can send you guys the gift card. And there will also be some polls right at the beginning, right away, and then we'll do some more polls kind of at the end. So we'd appreciate if you participated.
Oh, there we go. It took me a minute to, I don't know if you need me to poll, but I will.
All right, great. Thanks for answering those polls. If that little box doesn't disappear for you, there should be a little X in the corner that you can hit. And there'll be one more poll at the end. Thank you again for answering those. We send those answers back to our funders just so we can let them know who we're chatting with.
Awesome, thank you again. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenter for the evening, Kelly Sidoryk. In this interactive webinar, Kelly will review the principles of holistic planned adaptive grazing and talk about factors to consider and share the planning and monitoring processes. Kelly ranches with her family near Lloydminster. Over 25 years ago, they were introduced to holistic resource management, as it was known at the time. The process had a significant impact on their operation as it transitioned to be a forage-based livestock enterprise. She completed the degree program through HRM with a focus on the people side. In addition to running their family business, she has worked with many farm families as they worked on transitioning to the next generation. She also teaches holistic management, whole farm ranch planning courses, including goal setting, financial planning, land planning, grazing planning, strategic planning, and succession planning. She's a certified educator with Holistic Management International. She's also on the HMI board based out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Welcome, Kelly.
Caitlin, thank you so much. And Tanya as well. In these interesting COVID times with all our virtual activities, Tanya and I have been on meetings. This is the 3rd time in less than a week, and we've not yet met in person. So there is still some crazy benefits about all our virtual meetings. So as Caitlin had said, we hope that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll have time after the presentation or even during it that we can talk about and answer and dive a little bit deeper. I'll give a broad overview, and then if there's certain areas or topics that we need to pursue more, I'm really happy to do that. I think that's the best way that learning happens. So when I've been involved in the grazing schools for women as both a presenter and an attendee, and some of you may have heard this story before, but the first workshop that I attended, I can't remember the year, but some of the details of the story will help you to figure that out. it was at St. Paul, and our one evening social session steak fry was at a lake somewhere with a nice camp kitchen and all that. And the gals who had organized it had also got a local musician to come and entertain us that night. It was an informal social gathering, very nice, lots of networking. And it turns out that the entertainer was none other than Brett Kissel. And at that time, he didn't have a driver's license. So his grandma actually drove him out to the lake and he entertained us. So I don't know how old he is now. And he's certainly become very, very famous and popular and had a amazing career. So that's one of my stories and memories from one of the first conferences that I attended. I've always really appreciated the opportunity that it provides for us as women in agriculture to come together and really learn. And for the most part, I feel that in a supportive, really comfortable environment. And that isn't always the case in the whole industry, but I mean, things are really, there's so many women involved, and I think it's still great to have those learning opportunities for us as a group, and not to be exclusive of anybody else. But so yes, then as Caitlin mentioned, been involved in this for many years, and over that time, we've done a lot of grazing and learned a lot. And those are the things that I mostly want to share tonight. We've had some successes, we've had some missteps, I want to call them, or actually learnings, I guess is another way of terming it. And I think that one of the overall things that we just try to approach it with an open mindset and to be lifelong learners. So you'll see a little bit more about our operation as we go through. I have a few pictures of that. But we have probably over 60 paddocks, and we don't always run them together. We have both a cow-calf enterprise and a yearling enterprise, and we also do some custom grazing as well. So there's quite a bit of diversity in there with our enterprise mixes, and doing different things that hopefully are taking us towards our longer range goals and objectives. So I'm now going to start sharing my screen of the actual presentation. Okay, there we are. So this is just a picture of, as Caitlin mentioned, we are a family ranching enterprise, and that is one of the other things I like to do is take a lot of pictures, and that's a picture of our son. Okay, here's the part that I was wondering how was going to happen, where my slides aren't advancing. So just give me a second to muck with that and turn off my incoming video call. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and just go again to share screen. Try it from another way. Okay, there we go. All right, now it's advancing them properly. So one of the biggest things and points to keep in mind, I think, about planned grazing is the idea that it's about getting the animals to the right place at the right time for the right reasons with the right behavior. So just hang on, I've got to skip back for 1 second there. Why? I don't know why it seems to be sticking on me.
You can always just blame the heat.
Yeah,
I'm sure
among other things. Okay, here we go. There's a slide that it's skipping for some odd reason, but anyway, we'll just keep going with that. You know, I think there's a whole number of different grazing strategies and approaches out there, and there's all kinds of different names and terminology. You know, I mean, some people are doing continuous all season long grazing. Sometimes it's called rotational. You know, the AMP grazing, I think, is an appropriate term, the adaptive managed paddock grazing. So another term that you hear is the mob grazing, where they're having large herds in a small area for short periods of time with lots of moving. So I think that the takeaway from that, or the important thing to keep in mind, is it doesn't look exactly the same for everybody's operation and situation. So the idea is that we need to look at the principles, overlying principles, and then adapt them to our own situation and operation. Here's a couple of quotes that I'm sure many of you have heard, and why we're focusing on land health, because we don't inherit the land from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. You know, those overarching visions of why we're doing what we're doing. You know, often you hear people in agriculture, regardless of their production model, you know, talking about wanting to leave the land better than they found it. And, you know, I think that drives many of us, and certainly as we start looking at different principles, that's a big piece of it. You know, we talk about the importance of investing in soil fertility and building biological capital. So this is a friend of ours from Scott Campbell from the B-Bar-C Ranch at Meadow Lake, and just calling this diamonds, the tremendous amount of grass growth and seed heads and, you know, all those types of pieces. So I think also that what we're seeing in more recent years, talking about soil health and some of those principles about keeping the soil covered, having a continuous living plant or root, minimal soil disturbance, plant diversity, and integrating livestock are really all supported in a well-planned grazing program. We talk about the 24-letter word with plan, monitor, control, and replan. Because just as I said, that it will be different on every situation, every operation, I mean, it's also definitely going to be different from year to year. And so that's why we need to monitor what's going on, but still have that initial plan for how things are going to work in the first place. So the piece with livestock and soil fertility, you know, we think of livestock or cattle as being a tool to harvest the wealth and improve the land. We want them to capture that solar energy and convert it. They can serve multiple functions, you know, be it mowing, fertilizing, and somehow turning that into cash. We also, when I talk about the soil health component, are so much more aware now of not only the living organisms above ground, but those below ground in the soil. And they're also an organism that you must feed. And then thinking about how do we integrate livestock back into agriculture, not just as a separate enterprise. And ownership is only one way. There's getting to be lots of collaborative relationships where, you know, the custom grazing is just one example. And, you know, I should apologize because I'm going to reference cattle more often than not, but really any kind of grazing livestock. So the same ideas apply, whether it's sheep or goats or bison or whatever the ruminant it is that you have on your land. So another thing as we think about the profit and the health of the land, an old idea that we used to have was, oh my gosh, that grass got ahead of us or it's gone to waste. But we now realize that even if it isn't grazed, it will contribute to building the biological capital. And it doesn't always have to be fully harvested. I think for me, that was a paradigm shift to the way that we were looking at utilizing the forage. there's just a picture, you know, the between the ears picture that we're so lucky to be able to have in this industry of a set of yearlings that we use horses in our operation, but also sometimes the ATVs are a little bit more convenient. I think that we should use the horses more than we do, but. So of course, when you start thinking about putting a grazing program and a grazing plan together, a really important piece is your infrastructure. And so what have you got in the way of water, fencing, facilities? Because as these last few days of extreme temperatures go to show, you know, that's a critical component, thinking about central watering and how you're going to get water to your livestock. Also, a piece of that is the fencing component. Now, in this picture, I have the pretty traditional barbed wire fence, but you know, there's so many different ways that we can fence these days. And certainly in our operation and many others that are doing a planned paddock system with lots of moves, the electric fencing is a really valuable technology that we can use to help make paddocks smaller and have more temporary fences. It's important to think of, you know, what type of animals are you going to be grazing? What's your typical size of your herd? What are some of your long-term goals for your landscape and your operation? Of course, the finances, you know, I mean, I heard a quote the other day that somebody was on a custom fencing for 4-strand barbed wire was $13,000 a mile. So that's a huge investment. And we need to make sure that it fits into our financial plan as well. You know, when I talk about temporary fencing, I was kind of reminded of the some of the temporary fences that we have on our place that were actually put in 25 years ago and haven't moved. So I don't think you really class that as temporary, but you'll see from one of my slides coming up of our operation that there is the perimeter, and then as well as the our interior division fences. So, you know, there's lots of resources out there, but it's really important to think and plan how your fencing is going to work and what works best for you. Certainly just delving into the electric fencing a little bit, I think for many people, you know, the idea that one single wire will contain a large herd of animals is hard to get, but if it is properly energized with a good fencer, and another piece of it is especially, well, for all cattle, but certainly for the yearlings as well, the importance of having them trained so they know what the electric fence is. And once they're trained to it, they respect it more than 5-strand barbed wire, I think. So it might take some experimentation too, so you can get comfortable with what is the best for your situation. But there's a lot of good technology out there. So when we start thinking about our grazing plan, we're talking about managing the land, the soil, the animals, and the wildlife, so that during the growing season, we have maximum high quality forage for the long term. And if we can extend that and stockpile, all the better. During the non-growing season, which of course in this climate we definitely have, having the forage and or cover for livestock and wildlife again. We need to be able to deal with the weather challenges, and very importantly, make sure that we're meeting the nutritional requirements of the livestock and wildlife. We want there to be minimal stress on the animals and the people as we move them, but also maximize the coordination through a planning process. So how does the cropping fit into it? How does the wildlife needs? Is there other land uses? And then always we're trying to ensure that our plan is taking us towards our longer term holistic goal, which includes the social component, the people, it includes the finances, and it also includes the biological component. We talk about using different tools in our, again, I said the animals are a tool, and we can apply those in different ways. Sometimes it is simply through their grazing. Sometimes it's through their animal impact, and we might be trying to set up a situation where they're stirring up or impacting the land. We also use the tools of money, labor, and technology. Then we try to follow some guidelines with herd effect, stock density, time, that's an important one, population management, and above all, some human creativity. You know, I think that one of the things that probably many of you have heard in these types of grazing programs is trying to mimic Mother Nature. And of course, we can't completely replicate, so I guess it is mimicking. But going back in time to the development of the grasslands, when there was large herds of grazing animals, whichever type it was, that went across the prairies, and they would be, you know, tightly traveling in a herd, and they'd go to one area where they would graze it, and then they would leave and they would not come back for quite some time. And as you'll see, we're trying to recreate that in some ways as we move from paddock to paddock and allow the forages time to rest. So we want to think about the management considerations. You know, that falls into the areas of what our land use is, what about neighbors and access with other animals. Thinking about the actual areas that we will be grazing. Is there some that we want to exclude at certain times for whatever reason? What is the forage quantity and quality that we have? Again, thinking about the herd makeup. What size is it? What type of cattle? And a very important piece that we base so much of this on is the recovery period. And when I say that, I mean the recovery time for the plants in the paddock, that once you've been in there and grazed, you then leave and don't come back until the plants have adequately or fully recovered to what your requirements are. And then that helps us tell what our actual grazing periods are going to be. Then, of course, as I mentioned before, that monitoring and adjusting the plan. There's always going to be changes and adaptations, and I think being flexible is important for that. There's been some reference sometimes in the context when using the term rotation grazing, I mean, that there isn't enough adaptation. You just move by a calendar or dates on the calendar. And so it's still moving, but what we're trying to say is that we really are flexible and in the way that we are putting our plan together. So we, again, outlining our objectives for both the livestock and the grazing land, figuring out the amount of grazing and stored feed and the yields that we're potentially going to get, and then figuring out with some calculations what the feed needs are for both the grazing and the non-grazing period. We also make sure we put notes on our plans of special considerations. I already mentioned the one about, you know, perhaps the neighbor's bulls are on the other side of the paddock in the month of July, whatever the case may be. Then scheduling in the number of actual days grazing, and of course, reviewing the plan. So we actually go through a process on a big worksheet with a lot of colored paper or pens and markers, where we start putting this all together. There's so many variables that we're trying to deal with, and our brain really can only handle so many things at a time. So it's so much better for us to put this down on paper, or that some will say old school, because there's definitely some computer programs where you can do a lot of these calculations as well. I think it's also a really helpful tool for families or teams that are working together, because the planning of this as a group goes a long way to helping people know what's going on and what the objectives and plans are, and not only that, but why we're doing what we're doing. So that process can also be a very valuable tool. Here's just a picture of what the grazing chart looks like, but we won't worry about all the details of it right at this exact moment. So when we start are actually figuring out, I'm just going to go back to this one, when we start thinking of the determining our grazing and our stored feed parameters, we'll use the amount of acres that we have in each of our paddocks. We'll also try to project what the productivity is going to be. And for some time, when you're just first starting out doing that, that can be tricky to do. But if it's perhaps a hay field that you're used to getting a certain amount of bales off of, or whatever the case may be, that can be a starting point. Maybe it's something that you have grazed before, an area, and you can go back and look at, okay, well, there was so many cows there for so many days, and that there's so many acres. That will help you determine that. Another tool that we use a lot in our projections is the aspect that a cow will eat about 3% of its body weight dry matter. So for example, you know, a 1,200-pound cow would eat 40 pounds of hay, which is predominantly dry matter. So without getting too detailed in some of the pieces of it, that is how you can go and then figure out what your actual production was. And again, as I said, you know, we're making note of different areas for special considerations. Certainly this year has been a challenge in our area because, and I'm sure many of yours as well, because we started out being drier. And so we had some water spots that were a little bit on the less reliable side, and then it rained and now they're fine, but now it's hot and dry again. So, you know, some of those pieces where you might not have reliable water all the time, especially if you are relying on natural sloughs and ponds and that type of thing. So here is an example of a map where people are starting to put what their operation looks like together. Now, in this case, it's actually goats, which isn't what we have on our place, but I'll show you one of our maps coming up here. So the paddocks are, in this case, not in acres, but square feet. But I think it'll give you a good example of how the different paddocks are laid out. They're also identified, as you can hopefully see, with the paddock A, paddock A2. And then looking at the different considerations, K is at the bottom right-hand corner is the seasonal pond. And then there's some wooded areas that they're wanting to use at certain times of year. So getting a map is really important piece of it, an aerial photo where you can have this on. Certainly Google Earth is technology that helps this greatly. In Alberta, there's also the Alberta Soil Information Viewer. And at the end, we'll put some of these resources in the chat box for you to have. And that's a very good one. And I've been using that again lately because it's got some excellent measuring techniques on it where you can outline your pastures or your paddocks and it'll tell you the exact acreages in there. So that's another helpful tool. I think there's a few others technology that we can help or that we can access that really help us, but it's super important to have the overall map and identify the paddocks however you want to, but you know, whether it's letters or names or a number combination, I think is important to remember. One of the tips that somebody had given us back in the day was that if you use letters, then as they've done in this one, there's A and then A2. So it might have all been one paddock to begin with. And then when it gets subdivided, if you are doing that, or if you're doing some strip grazing, then you have a way to determine that. And then this next piece actually shows what they've put together for when their approximate moves are going to be and how many days they're going to be in those particular paddocks. Now, it does seem like a lot of days, but that is because in this particular situation with the goats, they're using electric netting. So again, and we'll talk about this as we go down a little deeper, the pieces of figuring out where you're going to be and for how long. This is the map of our operation. It is turned on its side. So we have a coulee running through the center of it, as you can hopefully see there. Coulee number 2 it is. And often case, we actually manage this as 2 separate grazing cells. So there's one on the bottom side, which is actually the west, and one on the top side, which is actually the east. But we do have the capability of combining them as well, which when we talk a little bit about one of the strategies for drought management, that is one. But I think what you can see from this is that there's nothing that's very consistent. You know, we have paddocks of all different sizes, shapes, configurations. Sometimes they were based on what an old fence was, and we just tried to work with that. Sometimes the top left-hand corner there, we did put in more rectangular paddocks, and that center heavier line actually leads to a water center that's just off the top of the map that you can't see. So that was how we did it, is that those paddocks all go down, access the lane, which then goes down to access the water center. The next one going clockwise with the one that's called Simon's East, those ones, again, there's a water lane, and down at number 7 in the coulee is a bit of a water center. So some of the rest of the ones, as you go around, have some naturally occurring water in them. That 40 is a water body. And then back to the next one that has 10, 11, and 12. There's a center down there at the, I guess I should be using a pointer, but just right at the top of the 6. So again, you know, I think that there's no exact way, and everybody would do it differently. And also there's things now that we have done one way that we wouldn't before. Many years ago, one of the cell design strategies that was popular was the wagon wheel with the water at the center. And that's something that also works. But what a lot of people found was that the animals really tend to loaf around and gravitate towards the center. And it's very hard to push them out to the outlying areas. But again, adapting to what works in your situation. So we talk about trying to figure out what landscape are we trying to create. There's some areas and people that I work with where they're trying to encourage more trees in their pastures. There's some other people that I work with further north, and they're trying to actually have an impact on the brush so that it isn't encroaching so much. So again, it depends on what your particular context and goals are. It's important to calculate how much total forage will the grazing cell have to supply. Remember, we talked about that with the number of animals and the pounds they're going to be consuming, and over your whole season, what does that translate to? And also thinking of that brought back to an average acre? And how long will the standing forage last? Certainly one of the another strategy that we have tried to use over the years is to extend the grazing season. So with the number of different paddocks, we can make a conscious decision that after a certain time, we're not going to go back into that paddock again that season, because we want to allow the forage to regrow and become stockpiled. So sometimes that stockpiled feed, of course, will be rationed out that season in the fall, early winter, or sometimes it will be held over and used for early grazing in the next spring. So there's a couple of different ways that you can use that, but certainly the key behind it is that when you're intentional, and it's so much easier when you do have all these different paddocks, that you can stockpile to extend the grazing season and then hopefully decrease your actual feeding time of stored feed, and in that save on some of the expenses for the cattle, because, you know, as many will tell you, one of the biggest ones, the biggest one is definitely the winter feed. So then also very important, trying to figure out, and everybody is different and their conditions are different, but how long a recovery period do you feel is required with each of your paddocks? And then given that, how long will they spend in each paddock and how long before they return again? There's many that will want to graze a paddock once and then give it the rest of the season to recover. We'll talk a little bit more about fast and slow growth, but certainly there's also times when optimal conditions and on a tame seeded situation where you can, you know, graze it more than once a season. But again, you're mindful of it and putting all of that together in a plan. And then when and where will you have to concentrate animals even more to maintain the healthy grassland, reduce weeds and woody vegetation, or if you have any challenges with serious erosion? One of the things that in our area that we seem to have as a challenge in our pastures is buckbrush. And the idea of concentrating animals using whatever tool it might be to really impact that. Back a number of years ago, we had a bit of thistles, some thistle patches surfacing, and one of the ways that we used to manage those was to put our mineral tubs in them. And something like that can definitely, you just be a bit strategic about, is there certain areas where you can put out your mineral or your salt, and the impact around that will help to push back some of those undesirable species. So when we're talking about some of the principles, it's really important to think about what actually is overgrazing. And we often think it's because there's too many animals, but it's really a function of time. And it actually happens to the individual plants, not the overall pastures. And so in this case, it is the matter of animals coming back too soon. So ideally, we'd like to be in that paddock, graze, manure, trample every plant, and then leave so full recovery can happen. But if we are staying in a pasture too long at one time, then we're increasing the chances of overgrazing. Or if we come back too soon before the plants have a chance to fully recover or get back near to the mature state. So if we think about it, when a plant first grows and the cow comes along and bites it off, then depending on how much has left, it will, through photosynthesis, start regrowing from the leaves, or if it needs to, it will then access and sacrifice some of the carbohydrates that are in the roots to regrow. And then once it gets to a certain stage, just total photosynthesis and it can regrow. But if it has only started regrowing and the animals are still there and they come back and graze again, now there's less material, more likelihood that it's going to have to use root reserves. Again, the plant just gets shorter, the roots are getting sacrificed again. So a bit more time, more regrowth, cow comes back again, and now it has really begun to compromise that plant. And of course, as well, because that regrowth is really attractive and palatable to the plant, that cows will start selecting that. So there might be mature, more mature, less palatable plants in abundance, but they keep coming back to that particular plant. So what we're really trying to do in our programs is to not let that happen. Now, again, there's times when, of course it will, but on a broader scale, if we're in a paddock for a while and then leave and let the plants recover, we're really, really reducing overgrazing. And that builds healthy forage plant communities. So again, if we're staying too long and there's insufficient recovery, just another way of saying it, returning to a pasture before plants have fully recovered from the last graze. And hopefully this, after the presentation, when we do have some more dialogue and questions, this will be a point that I want to come back to because it's really an important one for people to understand. So if we can talk about it, that is hopefully really helpful to the learning. So here is a photo that just illustrates that the first plant on the left with the really deep roots wasn't clipped at all. This was mechanically clipped for the sake of the study, but then the next one was clipped higher and just once, so there's still pretty robust roots there. And then the next one was clipped early or clipped again and without a long time, and you can just see what happens, that the sacrificing of the roots just continues, which of course weakens the plant. And there's also the important relationships with all the soil organisms underneath the ground that they have with the roots and the mycorrhizae fungi and the symbiotic relationships, which gets very complicated and feels like we need to go back to biology class again. But the idea being that this grazing and healthy plants with healthy root systems really promotes the soil organisms, which in turn help build soil health. So when we're putting our planning together, we are focusing on those three parameters. Like I said, the time we're there, the area and how big it is, and the volume of grass. So those are the ways that we put our plan together, keeping that all in mind. So for the management considerations, of course, financial need. What are our projections with that? What about the health of the land? Future landscape description, weather and the impacts of that. You know, when we're planning into an extended fall grazing, when does the snow come? Because that can be a game changer. Geography, is there certain areas that are inaccessible? What are the social needs? And of course, as I mentioned earlier on, what is the infrastructure? One of the pieces that's quite surprising to many, that when we start putting together a plan with some social needs on it, so that on our planning sheet or our planning chart, you know, we have at the end of August, there's a week vacation where we're not even going to be here. So we know as we put our plan together that the animals need to be in an appropriate spot, that either they can be in that paddock for a longer period of time, or it can be somewhere that we have somebody, a neighbor or someone that we can work with to help us put that together and look after the animals. But the idea people are surprised at that we build that into it, you know, so that the quality of life and thinking about what is important to our operations is built right in there. You know, I mean, another thing too will be things like major activities. You know, when does the branding happen? When do the animals need to be at a certain spot to deal with that? What about weaning? You know, do we need to be closer to the corrals for that to happen? Or, you know, all those different pieces. When do the bulls get turned out? I mean, an obvious one actually that I don't know why I didn't mention it first off is, you know, calving. If we're doing it out on the pasture, then which is the optimal places for that to happen? So our grazing time is influenced again by the amount of forage available, the number of areas, and the size of the paddock. So we just start to do some calculations. So if there's ADA is animal day per acre, and if we know that we can produce that from past records, or we can convert back with our dry matter consumption. But using that example, if we can produce 40 animal days per acre times 5 acres means we're going to produce 200 animal days. One cow is one animal in this example. So if you had 10 cows, that would then work out to the fact that you would have 20 days of grazing. Again, you don't need to worry about the exact details of this. I can always share the equations after, but it's a way for us to start projecting what we think our pastures can produce, especially if they are in smaller paddocks than they used to be. And then, you know, using those animal day per acres, we can start figuring out, you know, well, X number of cows equals X number of days. Or conversely, if it was something such as yearling cattle that you were thinking that you only wanted to have for 120, 135 days, then you can use those parameters to determine how many head you could run. Again, that, you know, don't worry about the, if this is getting more complicated than it seems necessary, because it's just to show that we do have some good calculations to be able to predict and assess our forage inventory, and then figuring out the stocking rate so we're comfortable, especially when you're starting out, if you haven't done a planned paddock grazing program, to make sure that your stocking rate is matching what your plans are. Certainly, once you've been doing it for a few years and starting improved productivity and keeping records, then it's easy enough to figure out what your best guesses can be. Of course, as everybody knows, there's good years and bad too, but if you work with an average there. So in this example, we're saying there's 10 cows that we want to graze for 270 days. So you need 2,700 animal days. And if the average forage quality is 40 and you're grazing it twice, that would give you 80 animal days per acre. You have 40 acres, so 80 animal days per acre times 40 means you will produce 3,200 animal days. And if you go back up, you actually needed 2,700. So you should be good because you do have enough feed for the grazing season and need to figure out buying it for those other days in the non-growing season. So thinking about the stocking rate, just what we're talking about with how many animals for how many days. And if you're trying to decrease your feeding, your winter feeding period, and then perhaps depending on what kind of animals you're running, you can adjust the ratios to determine what the stocking rate should be. Many of you will be familiar with Jim Garish. He's a grazing expert, I would say. He's been up to Alberta a number of times. The Beef Forage Associations have brought him up here. But he has an interesting exercise at his workshops where he has 4 people stand in the corners of the square, and then he'll say, okay, do you think that make the size of your square what you think would be have enough grass forage in it to feed an animal for 1 day. And it seems the first couple of times we did this, it's like, whoa, that's really hard to figure out. But you do kind of get a sense for it. And then you can start to say, just using conversions of the square feet to an acre, about what you think you might be able to produce. Of course, there's other ways, you know, where you actually take clippings and project it that way. Or as I said, if you have a sense of what hay production might be, you can use that as another calculation. So mentioned it earlier, back to it again, the recovery time. So it's the length of time for the desired plants, the perennial grasses, to recover. So it then stands to reason, if growth is slow, recovery is going to be slow and take longer. If it's fast growth, then recovery is quicker and those times can be shortened. So these are just an example, and this would be a pretty optimal tame, healthy tame, lots of moisture situation where a fast recovery would be in 30 days. In a fall or drier, 60 days. Again, this depends totally on where you are. There's a lot of places that this wouldn't be quite enough, but you know, in some cases, as I said, depending on the conditions, it would be enough. So when we're thinking about, there's a counterintuitive piece to this that it definitely took me a while to get my head around, because what happens during fast growth, when you want to be moving quicker and taking more of a clipping, is that it sometimes feels like we're leaving a lot of forage behind. And you go out and look and say, well, I don't think they need to move. There's still a lot of grass here. But keeping in mind that moving quicker so that you can do that clipping, we call it, then that really encourages regrowth. Now that won't always be the strategy depending on your situation. If you're in a graze once situation, then you know you still can go faster when the plants are growing quickly. The other idea, again, is leaving some of that material behind, because it can get tromped down to become organic matter, or it'll also feed the soil bugs and organisms. So as I said earlier, that piece about going to waste isn't really valid or the case, but that it is a hard thing when you see that you're maybe leaving a lot of forage behind, but keeping in mind you've got, depending on your number of paddocks, there could be a number ahead of you. So an important principle that we do go by, but again, keeping in mind in a fast growth period, if you're staying longer than 3 days, there's a chance of overgrazing. But there's different ways that you can deal with that too, where you strip graze or make paddocks smaller. And again, we're looking for an optimal here. It's never going to be exactly perfect. So when we think of one of the things that does help optimize that, it is the number of paddocks. And the more paddocks we have, then the more recovery time we have, the more flexibility, the greater stock density, certainly more even utilization, trampling and fertilization, and people using that temporary electric fence can increase the paddocks without the additional infrastructure. So they go out and they might have one reel with a tape on its set ahead of them and then one behind, and they can even do a leapfrog, so they're just getting a smaller amount at a time, and that can really extend your recovery time if you're feeling that you're getting behind on that. There's just a picture from a few years ago of yeah, you can see that our cows are mostly Black Angus, but we do still have a few Red Angus in there. So just going to show, there's what some of the, that, you know, that's calving. We calve end of April, beginning of May, and trying to time it when there's a lot of really good growth to help the animals, the cows especially, you know, get back into optimal space for calving and rebreeding, because, you know, with trying to rely on the grass to do that as opposed to the stored feed. So going back to the number of paddocks, this is just a couple of scenarios to go through. And if you had 4 paddocks and they're 10 acres each, that means the total of 40 acres. So if you are trying to achieve 60 days of recovery, then you take your number of paddocks minus 1. So 3 paddocks grazed for 60 days. So the 60 divided by 3. The reason you do this, subtract 1, is because you're always in one paddock, means that you would be in each paddock for 20 days grazing. That would be a long time. Animal performance could suffer, and overgrazing could occur in fast growth. But if you took that same 40 acres and had 10 paddocks, which would then be 4 acres each, you're still needing the 60 days recovery. So you take your 10 paddocks minus 1, again, you're always in 1, leaves you 9. So 60 days divided by 9 paddocks means you'd be in each paddock for 7 days. So you can just imagine that when you've decreased the grazing days from 20 to 70 to 7, then it's going to be better for animal performance and much less likely chance of overgrazing. So we can't understate the importance of monitoring the animal performance, you know, whether it's their weight gain or their milk production, and also really looking at the animal health. One of the things we talk about from a health point of view is that with this paddock system and moving, we do often break up the parasite cycles because we're not staying on the same ground. It's important to, you know, to be able to assess these pieces of animal health with their gut fill and the behavior and honestly what they are overall looking like. We joke a lot because this is a picture off of my phone, the cow pie you can see with some of the bugs already at work. And my kids will sometimes say to me that they're pretty sure not a lot of people have this picture on their phone. But I know there's a select few of us livestock grazers that that most definitely do. I heard a descriptor the other day when looking at the texture and quality of the manure to kind of get a handle on the animal performance and how their rumen is functioning, is that, you know, about the consistency of a pumpkin pie. So I thought that was a good descriptor to be able to reference. And certainly when right now, in our case, we're still on some pretty green growth, the animals are a little looser than making pumpkin pie. Now, excuse that, lots of talking here. So I referenced earlier one of the some grazing principles around drought management. And, some of us have certainly gotten the rain, but there's also lots that are in severe drought conditions. But, as one of the things we're really trying to do is to increase that recovery time, so that if we can combine herds, then that gives us access to more paddocks, and then hence more recovery time. It also gives us the opportunity to slow down. We might need to supplemental feed. I remember back a number of years ago when we had the bad drought in 02 and 03, where we did end up doing that, where we supplemental fed and really sacrificed a paddock. And, at that time, it seemed like we were brutal, like really annihilating it. But we could take some solace from the fact that that was just allowing all the rest of the paddocks to recover, so that we did have adequate amount of forage. Again, reducing numbers. But another attribute, especially if you're getting into drier conditions, of having with a paddock system like this, and there's been years that we've done this, saying, okay, well, right now we have 15, I'm just pulling numbers out of the air, but 15 paddocks ahead of us. We know that we can get X number of days, let's say 3, from each of those paddocks. That means that we for sure would have 45 days of grazing. So we've set that sometimes that we will say, okay, so what we need to do is in 30 days, revisit the situation. If it hasn't rained in 30 days. So everybody would be different in this regard, but setting that trigger point for your management. So instead of that constant nagging thing, when are we going to run out of grass? When are we going to run out of grass? You already have planned ahead to know that, in my example, of 45 days left. Now, of course, in the heat of August, sometimes I think you have to take into account grass burning off and deteriorating. So it might not be that long, but the point is it's a good predictor as you're managing, especially if you do find yourself in a situation where you expect that you're going to have to destock, that then you can set a cutoff date that says, okay, at this point in time, by July 30th, if it hasn't rained, we have to go to plan B, whatever that might be. So it's a valuable management strategy, I really think. We're thinking about when to breed, when to birth or wean, and trying to follow the principle of when nature tells us to, so working with nature in your grazing plan. Of course, different operations will be different depending on the enterprise mix, but trying to, capture as much free solar energy as we can. We talk about the 4 ecosystems that we work with a lot, and that's the water cycle, the mineral cycle. We talk about energy flow and how much our solar energy, as I just mentioned, are we capturing, as well as the community dynamics, and really trying to look at having diversity and biological complexity, because those situations are easier to manage and they're certainly less impacted by extremes. So we talk about, to try to work with those and really starting to look at how is the water cycle? Are we infiltrating? And there's lots of good information and workshops on trying to measure that. And certainly if we can increase our organic matter, we can definitely improve the water cycle, and hand in hand with that goes the mineral cycle. Also trying to think about minimizing bare ground or decreasing bare ground, because that's one way to immediately, you're growing more plants and increasing forage. But again, having the strategy of leaving some plant material to be able to cover that bare ground. And it takes some time to do, for sure. There's other ways that you can really achieve that. And certainly bale grazing is one, or some kind of feeding out on the fields or the paddocks to achieve that. And, you know, the quote that many of you will have heard or heard people say is that Mother Nature has deep pockets and she always bats last. And if within our systems we can try to work with that instead of against. Here's just an example of moving the animals to another paddock. You know, they quickly get used to, as many of you will know if you're doing this already, the idea, they know that when they move, it's to fresh green grass. And, you know, different people use different strategies, calling them, a whistle, different things, but they're pretty smart and they figure out early that they will be going to fresh, good feed. Sometimes they want to go earlier than you want them to, but, and if it's a cow herd, they get used to the idea and the calves grow up in it. So they know what moving regularly means. They also know what electric fence can mean. So here's some of the, you know, we've gone over quite a lot of material in just over an hour, and there's some resources. We'll leave this slide up. So my information, of course, there's lots of good information at holisticmanagement.org, the Savory Institute. Another good resource is onpasture.com. It's a newsletter that you can subscribe to. I think that's where I saw a Grazing 101 ebook, a couple of really good pasture, electronic pasture grazing planning tools. There's one with Maya Grazing, and there's another one, pasturemap.com. I referenced Jim Garish. He's definitely an expert grazer, as is another fellow by the name of Dr. Richard Teague. And his studies have, he's from the States, but his studies have taken him into the areas of really starting to look at the carbon sequestration that's going along with us improving the soil health and building organic matter. And of course, that's a whole nother kettle of fish and ball game to get involved in. So there's lots of interesting things happening there, and you're just seeing it more and more all the time about the value that the integrating livestock to build healthy ecosystems, you know, and that's starting to translate into our production and our marketing and the supply chain with verification of that. So really a lot of great resources. We've just kind of started with the tip of the iceberg of some of the things to consider. And, you know, on one hand, it might seem daunting, but once you get doing it, it becomes easier. But conversely, it's also, I feel like, a situation of the more you learn, the more you learn what you don't know. So anyway, so I hope that we can get some dialogue going, and at least Caitlin and Tanya and I are going to bounce back some questions. But yeah, please feel free to join in, and let's have a discussion or talk about some points. I'm going to get this share off but we can get that information to anybody if they would like it, and then the people can see you guys on the screen as well. So
sure. So because there's so few attendees, I am going to allow each of you to talk so that we can actually have a dialogue rather than typing anything into the chat. There is also an option to bring each of you up as a panelist. So that would be, you guys would be, show your lovely faces. But I understand that if you don't want to do that, you don't have to. So I've allowed each of you to speak there. So if you would like to ask Kelly any questions, please feel free. Because yeah, there's just the 6 of us. So let's keep this in person as much as in person as we can.
Yeah. I think we're getting more used to this being an almost in person. So, okay, Annette has raised her hand and her mic's off. So yeah, go ahead, Annette.
I was wondering, what do you recommend for training your animals to respect an electric fence?
Well, one of the things that we have over the past has set up a training pen. So in some cases, it was like a plank fence. In another one we've got right now is just the outside fence is barbed wire. But what we've done is we have an offset, so just a little bit, I don't know, 6 to 8 inches offset electric wire. And so that if they get up, they will touch that first. Another thing that I saw interesting is that if you put something on the fence, so one good thing is shiny pop or beer cans, or sometimes, like that flagging tape or something that's going to attract them, especially yearling animals are so very curious. And then they'll go up to it. And I think the idea with the offset is that when they're initially getting used to it, then because there's another barrier, they'll jump back. If there's no barrier, and you may have experienced this, they might go through it. And so, and the odd time it still happens for sure, because depending on the size of your herd, you might not get everybody to get a sense of it. And I really think in mother animals that, that they don't necessarily, the calves or the young don't even necessarily need to experience it, but they learn innately through their mothers. But that's been one important piece of it. And especially for, like I said, for yearling cattle that we have no idea whether they've been around an electric fence or not. That's what we've used as a way to have them in there for 2 or 3 days, and they'll soon get the other piece of it too that's important is that it's sending out enough power. I didn't get a chance to do it, but I should have, because in addition to having a cell phone with me most of the time, I also have a fence tester. So always to make sure that there is power on the fence. So, in especially one of our grazing cells is in a pretty populated area. So with that one, we use a electric plug-in fencer because it needs to be on all the time. So sometimes, and solar has come a long way in the last few years, so that certainly is more reliable. But then you have a planned power outage for 4 hours, and you're going, oh man, what are we gonna do? So anyway, does that help, Annette, to
Yeah, you bet. That does help. We have, I guess, we have some solar fencers, and I guess sometimes if there's tall grass touching the fence, that will rob the charge. Yeah, okay.
Yes, it totally will. And if it rains and there's grass on it, that can definitely pull it down. A couple of things will happen is that over a little bit of time, the power will burn that grass off if it's not super thick. But, sometimes there's some tools, especially if it might be even more brush-like than grass, that you might need to just take something like a weed eater and just keep it off, because it can definitely pull the power down. And then another piece of it is with whatever kind of rods or posts you're using, you need to have an insulator, so it can't, especially if you're using metal rods, like it's like grounding it. But even sometimes we had a situation this spring where it was a wood post but it was wet and it was drawing some power down. So some of the new fancier fence testers will actually give you an arrow indicator as to which way you need to go to find your power draw. So solving the big puzzle of where is the power going. But again, as you said, an important piece of it. Very important piece of it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions from Jen or Lisa? Or maybe Caitlin and Tanya, and I can have a couple
Sure,
conversations.
I have a question for you. In terms of riparian areas. So how do you manage for riparian areas in such an intensive grazing system?
Well, there's a couple of ways that we do it. And one is, as you know from our previous meetings, is to exclude, fence different areas completely out so that the cattle can't have access to it, and then use an off-site watering system of some kind. But the other thing to keep in mind is that because these cattle are moving so much, that sometimes that they will have access to a riparian area, but it's only for 4 or 5 days and then they're gone. So really, you'll see a little bit of impact, of course, in the short term, but when you come back in a little while, it is an impact, but it's just so minor, if that makes sense. Because of course, when you think of what you're getting at is if they have access to it for the whole grazing season, well, that's going to have definitely a negative impact. And in that case, paddocks that have the same riparian area, then we would fence it out. And the other one too is to be strategic, that maybe you'd be going into there in the deferred grazing later on in the season where it is less vulnerable. Is that the best word?
Yeah, that's an excellent word. Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's really, really helpful.
Annette got her hand up again. Perfect.
Okay, yeah. So talking about water there, like in your plan, your map there, you had I think at least 2 water lanes.
Yeah.
So, and you said those lanes led to water. So what kind of a watering system did it lead to? Because obviously they would be accessing that water for much longer than just a few days.
Yeah, exactly. So that the one that was in the top left-hand corner, well, they both are, there is a fairly deep pond, but it is fenced out, and we have a tank storage holding capacity with the tank, and then a pump and a float system. So the water's pumped into the tank and the float on the trough, so they access it through that. That's a stationary system that honestly we put in years and years ago. But we also have a portable system too. And the nice thing about that is you do just keep moving that around, so they're not in the same spot all the time, because you're exactly right. The water center I'm describing, it gets pretty impacted, but we try to have that over a smaller area with the use of the water lane. But there is still some sacrificial pieces, I guess you'd call it.
So you have a portable watering system. So you have like a water truck, or?
No, it's a kind of a wagon that that you can, like, we have to hook it on to the truck to move it. And it's got a trough and a pump and a hose and that type of thing.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. There's a few of them out there. Technology is really our friend in that. And there's also a lot of really creative, innovative people that have, we do have one that we don't use it anymore, but it was an old tanker, and that we had cleaned out, and then built a trough on the back of it. So then that one gets hauled from spot to spot as well. Caitlin, now I'm going to put you on the spot.
Oh, just one second. I see that Lisa's got her hand up there.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. Yeah, I'm okay. Okay.
Hi, I was just wondering what you're doing or using to estimate your yields on the pasture lake.
Well, now I can start figuring it out from previous records, but just like one of the pieces, like I said, Lisa, is, if you think of, that it was, I don't know, we'll just, for example, an 80-acre piece, that what were your past grazing records, or a quarter section or whatever, you know, and if you had 50 cows in there for 200 days, then there is 1,000, oh my God, is it 10,000? 50, yeah, that's 1,000 animal days. So there's your starting point, right? That even if you were then dividing that into four, let's say, you know that you would have at least a minimum of that. And once it's divided, you can start increasing in that. So does that make sense?
Yeah, and then you would just like visually assess based if it was dry or wet or.
Yes, for sure. And it feels like the first year, honestly, we drove around to our different paddocks and just guessed. But you know, we knew which one. Okay, this field is a good one. It produces pretty good, you know, and so we ranked that one as 100. And then, that was just a relative system. And then we found another, well, that's about 3/4 as good. So that's a 75, just so you have a way of not only taking into account the size of the paddock, but the quality of the forage it produces. Because you full well know you have some better fields and some worse, right? So that's just kind of the starting point. And like I said, sometimes people would anticipate, well, what sort of tonnage would we get off a hay crop here, you know, as a starting point to be able to figure that out. Also, another really good point is if there is in your area people that are doing this, they would be able to give you some estimates also. That starting out point's always tricky because you do feel a bit like you're guessing, I think. But honestly, once you get some under your belt, then it's easier to project from that.
And are you taking like samples for forage quality or anything, or?
Some people do, and that's certainly something that you can do. We did a trial where we were trying to rejuvenate some forage, and we did some samples for that one. And in that case, the fellow that we were working with just had a little, like, I don't know if it was like a 2-foot square that he just threw on the ground, a frame, and then we clipped with scissors, I don't know, about 2 inches, and then put that in a bag. And then we did another area, and then he sent that away to the feed lab, and it was able to do quality tests as well as quantity tests. So we were trying to determine if the area where we had put some more seed in had actually improved, and it had.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I think Jen had her hand up there if I saw for a sec.
Yeah, hi. I actually was wondering, for your forage crops, are you planting like a multi-species forage crop, or are you using just the natural wild crops that are growing?
Back in the day, like we seeded our tame pastures down many, many years ago. And I heard a term the other day, modified native. Was that what it was, Tanya? Because I've wondered that, you know, for forages that have been, like, honestly, it's been down for 30 years. There's a lot of what we would call native species in there, but it's not true native, right? Anyway, but without going down on, sorry for getting on a tangent there, but one of the ideas, Jen, is that as many species as we can, like the more species, the better. And then, because that's more diverse, but also keeping in mind affordability too, right? Because it's expensive. So, you know, what can you get in there, and, you know, what are some of the forages that grow well in your area? But when in doubt, add some more species, I think.
Yeah, because I've read the Gabe Brown's book, and we've watched a few seminars, and we just bought our property last year, so our hayfield, or our back section, was actually rented out to the neighbors for cereal crops for however many years, for the last how many years. So we'll be replanting it, and they recommend doing between 9 and 12 species for forage crops. So I was just wondering if if you're seeing success with that here in Alberta.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And even more so, like, as they're doing this along with a cover or cocktail crop, to help. So there's some forage that's taken off one form or another, but also with the perennial, those might be some annuals, but the perennials seeded along with that. And certainly that's something that there's a lot more of happening, I'd say, in the last few years, that people are having a lot of success with. And Gabe Brown is definitely, I should have him on my list, actually. That's, I'm glad you brought it up. He's a pioneer in that, or a trailblazer or whatever in that regard, especially as people are trying to incorporate some cropping as well, or convert.
Yeah, his methodology is pretty interesting. I have his book, and my dad's actually gone to a conference down in the States that he was part of, and it's interesting just seeing how they started out and where they've come to, and between that and trying to replant some native species, it's kind of, I feel like it's a balancing act, but that's something that we're aiming towards here. So
for sure, that's so true, Jen. I think all of this is a balancing act too, because I mean, honestly, even with the planned grazing, and like I said, there's days that it doesn't go according to plan, and it's like, oh my gosh, okay, well, they all are in the wrong paddock and it got grazed harder than you wanted it to. And but still, I mean, overall making progress by essentially trying to minimize overgrazing, cover the bare ground, and it just leads to healthier and healthier forage stands, which leads to healthier and healthier livestock and better performance and ecosystem health and all those benefits. But yeah, if you think there's any such thing as perfection in this, I haven't found it yet, but a lot of progress. So which I think is a life lesson too, so that I have to remind myself of once in a while. Caitlin, did you have something? And you tell me, you girls, when what the timeline is here.
Yeah, I do have a question actually. So I think this type of management is very interesting, but I'm wondering what is in your opinion the biggest struggle with adaptive grazing that you've seen?
That for the first few steps, and like the first few years, just to get some establishment and a little bit of confidence, right? Also, for a lot of many people, it is just that, the people, because some members of the operation will be more gung-ho than others. We were very lucky in ours years ago because my parents were pretty keen on it too. So we did lots of experiments, and kind of in some cases, I think maybe we went faster than we should have. But that, there's another educator from Australia, and he talks about setting up safe to fail trials. So if you're unsure, here's an example, do it on a quarter section, not the entire operation, right? Because the same principles can apply. You can have some temporary fencing, you can have some paddocks, you can move them, and just make sure that as you're doing something, it's not risking it all, I guess, would be a biggest part of it. Another big challenge for us when not long after we got started was that major drought. And so, some of the destocking should have happened earlier, but it's going to rain tomorrow, right? It's going to rain tomorrow. So, and hindsight is 2020 on that one, for sure. So it's so exciting to me too, with all this stuff going on with soil health, because that's sort of bringing this all back to the forefront again about what a great tool it can be. And with the adaptive management piece too, it doesn't just need to be grazing, it can be cropping incorporated in there as well. And like Jen brought up, Gabe Brown's done a lot to help move that ball forward too, as we can improve soil health and still have some cropping as well. while decreasing, hopefully, expensive inputs.
All right, so any last questions for Kelly? We're just past our 8:30 deadline, but we've had some good conversations. So, and if not, then I'm going to launch our last poll. So if you can add to the poll right before Caitlin's going to do the draw for the gift card.
Oh, yeah.
And you guys have an excellent chance. There we go.
I'm just going to figure out how to share my screen here for the draw while we're waiting.
Oh, great. Looks like we just got 2 out of 3, but that's all right. Well, thank you guys so much.
That's cool. Wheel of names. Okay, I'm going to have to remember that one.
Okay, so yeah, like I said, this is for $50 PV Mart gift card. And yeah, the winner needs to put their address in the chat to the panelists and we'll get it sent off to you. So here we go.
Annette.
Looks like Annette is our winner. So awesome, congratulations.
And PB Mart has some great electric fencing supplies too, among other things,
They got everything. Okay. Yeah, so Annette, if you want to put your address in the chat, we'll get your gift card sent to you. Awesome. So I guess, yeah, on behalf of Cows and Fish and the municipalities involved with the Grazing School for Women, we'd like to thank everyone for taking time out of their evening to join us. And a big thank you to Kelly for all the great information and for the presentation tonight. That was awesome. And yeah, it was pretty good conversation at the end. That was good. So nice to see.
Well, thank you guys so much for including me and for adapting the Grazing School for a virtual format. Yeah, I look forward to doing these in person because really great discussions, you know, the piece about there's info to share, but the best learning is when we share ideas and questions with each other, I've always found. So yeah, I really appreciate that. And people have my contact info, kellysidoryk.com, and check that out. And yeah, we look forward to the in-person event that we're going to have. Maybe we should see if Brett Kissel can come. His grandma doesn't have to drive him anymore, though. That was funny. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much, everybody. If you want to see a recording of this, it will be on our YouTube channel, the Cows and Fish YouTube channel, probably over the next week or so. Along with the recording of the first session that was on June 9th, I believe. So, all right. Well, thanks, everyone, and have a great night.
Yes, and cooler weather.
Maybe some rain, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. On the weekend, it's coming. So yeah, I've been told. Okay. Thanks, ladies. Enjoy.